The straw pricked Abigail's cheek, sharp and unforgiving, a stark contrast to the feather pillows she'd once dreamed of. Cold, damp air, thick with the scent of manure and decay, seeped through her thin calico dress, chilling her to the bone. Cast out, publicly shamed, deemed too much woman for a man too small of heart, the dilapidated barn was now her only refuge. Shame burned in her chest, a hot, acrid thing, but beneath it, a spark of defiance still flickered. She was Abigail Henderson, and she was more than her measurements. Just as another wave of despair threatened to pull her under, a new shadow fell across the splintered, makeshift doorway. It was long and lean, stretching into the dusty interior. Her heart leaped into her throat. Finch's men, back to torment her further? But no. The silhouette that filled the opening was different. Mounted on a painted stallion, powerful and poised, sat a warrior. His face was unreadable in the dim light, but the way he held himself, the aura of coiled readiness, spoke of something far removed from the petty cruelties of Redemption Gulch. His arrival felt like an omen, a shift in the very wind that whispered through the broken planks. Was this greater peril, or an impossible, unlooked-for salvation? The answer, Abigail sensed, would change everything. Back east, in the crowded, judgmental parlors of Philadelphia, Abigail Henderson had always felt like an ill-fitting piece in an intricate, unforgiving puzzle. She possessed a robust spirit, a capable mind, and hands skilled in the practical arts that kept a household running and a garden thriving. She could bake bread that rose golden and light, mend clothes until they were stronger than new, and soothe a colicky baby with a patience that bordered on saintly. These were qualities of substance, of real worth. Yet society's gaze, shallow and unwavering, consistently bypassed these virtues, settling instead on her generous form. Whispers followed her like persistent shadows. She was too sturdy, too ample, not the delicate flower man supposedly desired. Suitors were few, and those who did approach often did so with a poorly concealed air of settling, or worse, with an eye on her small, inherited dowry. Orphaned at 16, she'd learned self-reliance the hard way, navigating a world that offered little solace to a woman alone, especially one who didn't conform to its narrow ideals of beauty. The advertisement in the Eastern Gazette, tucked between notices for patent medicines and land auctions, had felt like a beacon. Mr. Alistair Finch of Redemption Gulch, Dakota Territory, sought a wife. His letters, penned in a surprisingly elegant script, spoke not of beauty, but of companionship, of a shared life building something lasting on the frontier. He described a prosperous, growing ranch, the need for a sensible, hard-working woman to make it a home. He praised her honest replies to his inquiries, her detailed accounts of her homemaking skills. He never once asked for a daguerreotype, a fact that Abigail had clung to as a sign of his sincerity, his focus on inner qualities. She had poured all her dwindling funds, all her desperate hopes, into the westward journey, each mile jolting over rutted trails, each dusty sunrise bringing her closer to Redemption Gulch, had been a step away from the suffocating judgment of the East and, she prayed, towards a life of acceptance. She envisioned a simple, sturdy farmhouse, the smell of wood smoke and baking, a man who would see the strength in her hands and the loyalty in her heart. She wasn't naive. She knew frontier life would be demanding, filled with hardship, but she was prepared for hard work. She craved it, if it meant a place where she belonged. The name itself, Redemption Gulch, whispered of second chances, of washing away past slights. As the stagecoach, caked in the mud and alkali dust of 1,000 grueling miles, finally groaned towards the raw, burgeoning settlement, Abigail smoothed her travel-worn dress, her hands trembling not just from fatigue, but from a potent cocktail of fear and fragile, burgeoning hope. This was it. Her new life was about to begin. The coach lurched to a halt before a 2-story false-front building bearing the ambitious sign, the Redemption Hotel and Saloon. A scattering of townsfolk, weather-beaten men in dusty Stetsons, a few women in faded calico paused in their errands, turned to observe the new arrivals. Their faces were impassive, their eyes missing nothing. Abigail's gaze swept the small assembly, searching for a man who matched the dignified tone of Mr. Finch's letters. A figure detached itself from the shadows of the hotel's covered porch. He was taller than she'd imagined, dressed in a dark, well-cut frock coat and trousers that seemed more suited to a Boston bank than a Dakota outpost. His dark hair was slicked back from a high forehead, and a neatly trimmed mustache adorned his upper lip. This must be Alistair Finch. Her heart gave a hopeful flutter. He moved with an air of studied importance, his gaze passing over the other disembarking passengers with cool disinterest until it landed squarely on Abigail. As she stepped down from the coach, her worn carpet-bag clutched tightly. The expression on his face shifted. It wasn't the warm recognition she'd prayed for. It wasn't even polite curiosity. It was something else. A flicker of surprise, rapidly hardening into distinct, unmistakable dismay. Abigail offered a tentative smile, her throat suddenly dry. "Mr. Finch," she began, her voice a little breathless. "I am Abigail Henderson." Alistair Finch's lips, which had perhaps been poised to offer a civil greeting, thinned into a tight, disapproving line. He subjected her to a slow, deliberate appraisal, from the sensible bonnet on her head to the sturdy toes of her worn boots, and lingered pointedly on the expanse in between. The air, moments before filled with the mundane sounds of the frontier town, grew taut, charged with a sudden, dreadful silence. He did not extend a hand. He did not offer a single word of welcome. Instead, a sneer, ugly and sharp, twisted his mouth. "You," he enunciated with chilling clarity, his voice carrying to every curious ear. "You are Abigail Henderson?" He took another insolent step closer, his eyes, cold and gray as winter river stones, raking over her again, lingering on her figure with an expression of profound distaste. The letters, they were quite remiss. They failed to mention certain, significant particulars. Abigail's stomach clenched into a painful knot. The hope that had sustained her across a continent dissolved like sugar in rain. The curious stares of the onlookers felt like physical blows, hot and shaming. I don't understand, sir," she stammered, the polite words of greeting she had rehearsed 1,000 times dying unspoken on her tongue. Her cheeks burned with a humiliating fire. Finch emitted a short, derisive bark of laughter that held no humor, only contempt. "It seems, madam," he declared, his voice dripping with sarcasm, "that you are more substantial than was advertised. Considerably more." He made a vague, dismissive gesture towards her body, as if she were a poorly chosen piece of livestock. "I advertised for a wife, a companion to grace my home, not a draft horse to plow my fields." The cruelty of his words, delivered so publicly, so callously, struck Abigail with the force of a physical assault. Tears pricked the backs of her eyes, hot and stinging, but she fought them back with a lifetime of practiced stoicism. Around them, a few snickers rippled through the small crowd, though some townsfolk had the decency to look away, their expressions troubled or embarrassed. She could feel the weight of every gaze, every unspoken judgment, pressing down on her. "But your letters," she managed, her voice trembling despite her efforts. "You wrote of needing a capable woman, a strong partner." "Capable, yes," Finch interrupted, his tone like shards of ice. "Not excessively proportioned. It simply will not do. You are not what I envisioned. You are not what I paid for." He glanced around, a flush rising on his own neck, as if her very presence beside him was a source of acute personal embarrassment. His gaze, seeking an escape, fell upon a dilapidated, weather-beaten barn standing forlornly at the edge of his property, a short distance from where they stood. "My home," he said, gesturing vaguely towards a neat, two-story clapboard house with a tidy white picket fence, the very image of domestic respectability she had yearned for, "is not equipped for surprises of this magnitude." He then pointed a sharp, dismissive finger towards a barn. "You may take shelter in the barn for the night. The next eastbound stagecoach is due in 2 days. I strongly suggest you avail yourself of its services. Consider your passage my final, and frankly, overly generous, expenditure on this regrettable affair. Tears now threatened to overflow, but Abigail blinked them back furiously. The barn. He was consigning her to the barn, like an unwanted animal, after she had crossed a country based on his written promises. The hopeful, shining name of Redemption Gulch had transformed into a cruel, twisted mockery. Her long, arduous journey had ended not with a welcoming embrace, but with a slammed door in her face and the biting, public shame of utter rejection. What manner of man was this Alistair Finch? Who could be so casually, so publicly cruel? And what, in God's name, was to become of her, stranded, penniless, and alone, with only the cold, indifferent comfort of a barn to call her shelter in this harsh, unforgiving land? The heavy barn door groaned open on ancient, rusted hinges, protesting the intrusion. It revealed an interior steeped in the gloom of disuse, smelling sharply of old, decaying hay, the lingering ammonia of long-gone livestock, and the pervasive scent of dust and damp earth. Cobwebs, thick as funeral shrouds, draped the rafters and corners, their silken threads glinting faintly in the slivers of pallid light that pierced through the numerous cracks in the warped plank walls. Abigail stepped inside, her worn carpet-bag hitting the packed dirt floor with a dull, final-sounding thud. This, then, was to be her bridal suite, her temporary sanctuary from the venomous scorn of Alistair Finch and the curious, pitying, or perhaps mocking, eyes of Redemption Gulch. It was colder inside than out, the kind of penetrating chill that settled deep in the bones. Spiders, the architects of this desolate space, had woven intricate, dusty tapestries in every conceivable nook. The faint, intermittent rustling in the deeper shadows hinted at other, less welcome occupants, rats, perhaps, or snakes seeking refuge from the cooling air. She sank onto a loose pile of brittle straw in a relatively clean corner, the fight momentarily draining out of her like water from a sieve. The relentless, bone-jarring journey, the radiant hopes she had nurtured with such care, Finch's brutal, public dismissal, it was a confluence of miseries almost too profound to bear. She had traveled with such fervent anticipation, carrying not only her own hopes, but also the weight of the ideal woman Finch had seemingly conjured from her carefully worded letters. He had written of valuing a sturdy constitution and a practical mind, qualities Abigail knew, with an unshakable certainty, that she possessed in abundance. He had spoken of his own loneliness on his supposedly prosperous ranch, of needing a true partner to share the burdens and build a future under the vast Dakota skies. His words had been chosen with such apparent care, painting a picture of a thoughtful man seeking genuine companionship, a haven from isolation. Now, witnessing his visceral revulsion, his swift and public denouncement, she understood the bitter truth. His definition of sturdy and practical had been nothing more than a veiled euphemism, a coded desire for a woman who met a specific, unspoken physical ideal, an ideal she clearly, in his dismissive eyes, failed catastrophically to achieve. He was a man of surfaces, she realized with a sickening lurch, a preening peacock obsessed with appearances, strutting his borrowed finery in a raw-boned town that perhaps didn't value such superficialities as much as he desperately believed. As the last vestiges of daylight bled from the sky, darkness seeped into the barn like a tangible entity, bringing with it a deeper, more insistent chill. Abigail huddled in the scratchy straw, pulling her thin shawl tighter around her shoulders. Her stomach ached with a gnawing hunger. She hadn't eaten properly since the meager breakfast at the last stage stop, and her heart ached with a profound, soul-deep sense of betrayal. Sleep was an elusive phantom. Every creak of the barn's ancient timbers, every distant, mournful howl of a coyote echoing across the plains, sent a fresh jolt of fear and desolation through her. She thought of the townsfolk she had glimpsed. Some had looked away, their faces tinged with what might have been embarrassment or discomfort. Others, particularly a group of lounging men near the saloon, had openly smirked, their eyes filled with a lewd curiosity. No one had spoken up. No one had offered a hand, a kind word. She was an outsider, an unwelcome disruption, a source of fleeting, cruel amusement in their otherwise monotonous day. The next morning, Abigail awoke stiff, her limbs aching, the cold having settled into her very marrow. But with the pale light of dawn came a renewed, if fragile, determination. She would not simply crumble. She had to speak to Finch again. Perhaps, in the clear light of day, with his initial temper hopefully cooled, he might display a sliver of common decency, a modicum of human compassion. She found him on the covered porch of his well-kept house, seated in a rocking chair, sipping coffee from a delicate porcelain cup. He looked for all the world like a gentleman of leisure, his neatly pressed trousers and silk brocade vest a stark, jarring contrast to her own travel-stained dress and the lingering grime of the barn. "Mr. Finch," she began, her voice surprisingly steady, betraying none of the tremor she felt inside. "I understand I am not what you expected. I am truly sorry for any misapprehension. However, I have traveled a great distance, at no small expense and considerable hardship. I have very little money remaining. To send me back east with no resources, no means of support, is—" He cut her off with an abrupt, impatient wave of his hand, not even deigning to look at her directly, his gaze fixed on some distant point beyond the picket fence. "Your financial predicament, madam, is hardly my concern, nor my responsibility. You, by your own admission or omission, misrepresented yourself." "I misrepresented nothing, sir," Abigail insisted, a spark of righteous anger finally igniting within her, warming her momentarily against the chill of his disdain. "I answered all your inquiries truthfully and fully. I am, as I stated, a capable worker. I can cook, I can clean, I can manage a household with efficiency and skill. I can—" "Your ample dimensions were regrettably not mentioned," he interjected coolly, his lip curling with unconcealed distaste. "And in Redemption Gulch, a town I aspire to help lead into a more civilized era, appearances matter a great deal. My wife must be a credit to me, an asset to my standing, not a subject of public ridicule or pity." He finally turned his gaze fully upon her, and it was filled with such icy, dismissive contempt that she physically recoiled. "The stagecoach departs tomorrow. Ensure you are on it. Until then, you will remain within the confines of the barn and its immediate vicinity. Stay out of my sight." His tone was final. He turned back to his coffee, dismissing her as though she were a bothersome insect he had swatted away. Defeated for the moment, Abigail retreated, the weight of his callousness pressing down on her. His cruelty was a high, smooth wall she couldn't seem to breach, his vanity an impenetrable fortress. As she walked slowly back towards the dubious sanctuary of the barn, she was acutely aware of the eyes of the town upon her. An older woman, her face etched with the hardships of frontier life, was hanging laundry behind the general store. She offered Abigail a fleeting, almost furtive glance that might have held a hint of sympathy before quickly looking away, as if afraid to be seen acknowledging the outcast. A group of rough-looking men, lounging on upturned barrels outside the saloon, were less discreet. They openly leered, their muttered comments, laced with crude suggestions and derisive laughter, reaching her ears like poisoned darts. She was a spectacle, a pariah. From a sun-drenched, rocky rise overlooking the scattered, raw-edged buildings of Redemption Gulch, a lone rider watched, still as the ancient stones around him. Koda, his face a mask of impassivity that revealed nothing of his thoughts, his eyes as keen and far-seeing as a hawk's, had observed the stagecoach's arrival the previous day. He had seen the woman Abigail, her shoulders squared with a hope that seemed too delicate, too vulnerable for this harsh, unforgiving land. And he had seen, with a cold knot forming in his gut, Finch's contemptuous dismissal, the arrogant pointing finger directing her towards the ignominy of the barn. Koda was Navajo, a man who lived by the ancient rhythms of the earth and the unwritten laws of his people, a warrior whose very presence on the outskirts of settler towns often bred unease, fear, and suspicion. They called him outlaw, renegade, savage. He had his own reasons for being near Redemption Gulch, complex reasons that had little to do with its boisterous, often oblivious inhabitants. But the blatant, public cruelty he had witnessed yesterday, and Finch's ongoing disdain today, stirred something deep within him, a quiet, simmering anger that settled like a hot stone in his belly. He had encountered Alistair Finch before, noted his pompous arrogance, the disdainful way he treated his hired help, the contempt he held for anyone he deemed beneath his station. This latest act, this callous shaming of a vulnerable woman, was merely another layer of ugliness on a man already deeply marked by his own flawed character. Koda continued to watch, a silent, patient observer, the prairie wind tugging at the single eagle feather tied in his long, dark hair. The woman in the barn, she believed herself utterly alone, but she was not as unnoticed as she, or Finch, imagined. The days that followed Abigail's public rejection stretched into a slow, grinding torment. Alistair Finch, it seemed, was not content with merely shunning her. He appeared determined to make her brief, enforce stay as miserable as humanly possible. He issued stern instructions to his two ranch hands, a pair of surly, brutish men named Barlow and Cutter, to ensure she didn't stray from the barn or its immediate, desolate surroundings. They seemed to take a course, brutish pleasure in their assigned task, their eyes lingering on her with the repulsive mixture of contempt and delirium, predatory interest whenever she was forced to venture out to the muddy, algae-choked well at the far edge of the property for water, the only concession Finch had made to her basic needs. "Looks like the prize sow needs slop in again." Barlow, a hulking man with small, mean eyes and a perpetually vacant expression, would cackle loudly enough for half the town to hear. Cutter, leaner but wirier, with a hyena's grin, would invariably join in with a braying laugh, adding his own crude embellishments. Their taunts were a constant, grating reminder of her humiliation. Food, or the lack thereof, became a pressing, agonizing issue. Finch provided absolutely nothing. The small, carefully hoarded store of dry biscuits and salted meat she'd brought with her from the east dwindled with alarming rapidity. A persistent, gnawing hunger became her constant companion, weakening her body and fraying her nerves. One afternoon, driven by a desperation that overrode her pride, she ventured to the back door of Finch's main house, hoping to appeal to his cook, if such a person existed, or perhaps even to Finch himself, in a moment of unguarded humanity. Finch himself answered her hesitant knock, his face contorting into a mask of incandescent fury when he saw her standing there. "Are you deaf as well as oversized?" he hissed, his voice low and venomous, his eyes blazing with cold fire. "I gave you explicit instructions to stay away from my house. There's nothing for you here, woman. Nothing." He slammed the door in her face with such force that the small porch seemed to shudder. The sharp, metallic click of the latch felt like another nail being driven into the coffin of her hopes. Yet, even within the dusty, oppressive confines of the barn, Abigail found small ways to assert her unvanquished spirit. She meticulously cleaned a corner for herself, sweeping the dirt floor with a broken branch, and using an old, discarded horse blanket she discovered in a dark stall to ward off some of the persistent night chill. In that same forgotten stall, she discovered a tiny, sickly calf, abandoned and shivering, its mother likely lost to predators or sold off by Finch. Its ribs showed through its hide, and its breathing was shallow. With gentle hands and soft, crooning words, a stark contrast to the harshness she herself endured, she coaxed the weak creature to drink a little water from her cupped hands, and later, when it was stronger, from a dented pail. Tending to this small, vulnerable life gave her a sliver of purpose, a brief, poignant respite from her own bleak, suffocating situation. Her practical skills, so viciously derided by Finch, were now her only solace, her only connection to a world where nurturing and care still held meaning. One bleak morning, as she awoke to the familiar ache of hunger and cold, she noticed something unusual just inside the barn door, half hidden in the shadows. Her heart hammered against her ribs. Was it some new cruelty devised by Finch? Cautiously, her senses on high alert, she approached. It was a small bundle, neatly wrapped in a piece of cured deer hide and tied with a strip of sinew. With trembling fingers, she unwrapped it. Inside, nestled on a bed of fresh leaves, were 3 golden-brown corn cakes, still faintly warm, and a generous strip of what looked and smelled like expertly dried venison. There was no note, no discernible clue as to who might have left this unexpected bounty. Had one of the townsfolk, perhaps the woman hanging laundry, taken pity on her after all? Or could it, improbably, be Finch, experiencing a rare, uncharacteristic moment of what? Guilt? Remorse? It seemed utterly unlikely, given his consistent venom. The food, regardless of its source, was a godsend, an answer to a prayer she hadn't even dared to utter. She ate slowly, reverently, savoring every precious mouthful, the unexpected kindness a soothing balm to her wounded spirit, a tiny ember of hope rekindled in the darkness. The following dawn, another small offering appeared in the same spot, a tightly stoppered waterskin, full of cool, clean water, a stark contrast to the brackish liquid from Finch's neglected well. Abigail felt a distinct flicker of hope, stronger this time. Someone was watching. Someone knew of her dire plight and was offering tangible help, however covertly. She scanned the perimeter of Finch's property, her gaze sweeping across the distant, sun-baked hills, searching for any sign of her benefactor, but saw no one. Only the wind whispered through the dry grass, carrying secrets she couldn't yet decipher. Koda remained unseen, a phantom presence moving with the silence and grace of the prairie wind. He had seen Finch's oafish ranch hands deliberately denying her access to the main well near the house, forcing her to use the muddy, polluted seep near the creek bed. He had seen the gauntness in her face, the shadows of hunger and quiet despair in her eyes. His people had a name for men like Alistair Finch, those who steal the breath of others with their pride and greed. The small, anonymous gifts of food and water were a simple gesture, a quiet counterpoint to the settler's loud, ostentatious cruelty. He was not yet ready to intervene directly, to reveal himself. He was still observing, still learning the intricate, often ugly, patterns of this fledgling town, taking the true measure of its inhabitants and its self-proclaimed leader. But Finch's malice, Koda sensed, was like a festering wound. It was escalating, and it would not be content with mere neglect for much longer. Alistair Finch, meanwhile, was growing increasingly agitated, his mood darkening with each passing day that Abigail Henderson remained on his property. His grand, carefully orchestrated plan to acquire a pretty, demure, and suitably docile wife, one who would significantly elevate his perceived social standing in Redemption Gulch, a town he secretly despised for its crudeness, but desperately hoped to dominate, had backfired in the most spectacular and public fashion. Abigail, with her quiet, infuriating resilience and her stubborn refusal to simply vanish into thin air, was a constant, walking embarrassment, a daily, visible reminder of his egregious misjudgment and the town's silent, or not so silent, amusement at his expense. The eastbound stage wasn't due for another full day, and the thought of her continuing to occupy his barn, a potent symbol of his failed transaction, gnawed at his vanity and fueled his considerable ire. He needed her gone, completely and irrevocably gone, and his already thin patience had finally snapped. He summoned Barlow and Cutter to the porch of his house, his face a thundercloud. "That woman," he snarled, his voice tight with suppressed fury, gesturing contemptuously towards the distant barn. "She has become an intolerable nuisance, an eyesore. Tomorrow morning, well before the stagecoach is due, indeed, before sunup, I want her escorted a few miles out of town. Take her westward, towards the Broken Arrow Creek. Leave her by that old, lightning-struck cottonwood, with a small canteen of water, perhaps. Let her find her own way from there." His eyes gleamed with a cold, cruel, reptilian light. "Perhaps some passing traders, or even a band of wandering Comanches, will find her accommodating. Or perhaps the coyotes will. Either way, she will cease to be my problem." Barlow, the hulking, slow-witted brute, grinned, revealing a set of stained, uneven teeth. And if she don't want to go peaceably, boss? What then? Finch's smile was thin and sharp as a shard of glass. Persuade her. Use whatever means necessary. Just ensure she is gone from my property, and from the vicinity of Redemption Gulch, before the town awakens. And above all, make absolutely certain no one sees you. Leaving a lone, unprotected woman stranded in the harsh, unforgiving wilderness, especially one he clearly considered undesirable and thus expendable, was tantamount to a death sentence, or worse. It was a new, despicable low, even for a man as morally bankrupt as Alistair Finch. That evening, as a dramatic prairie twilight painted the western sky in breathtaking hues of bruised purple, fiery orange, and blood red, Abigail was in the barn, gently tending to the little calf. It was noticeably stronger now, its coat shinier, and it nuzzled her hand with growing affection. A sudden, sharp noise at the main barn door made her jump, her heart instantly pounding. Barlow and Cutter stood silhouetted against the rapidly fading light, their bulky forms filling the doorway, their expressions unpleasantly predatory. "Evening, ma'am," Barlow drawled, his voice unctuous and insincere as he stepped inside, Cutter following close behind him, his small eyes darting around the gloomy interior. "Mr. Finch has got some new travel plans for you. A special, expedited departure." Abigail's blood ran cold. A chill deeper than the evening air settled over her. "The stagecoach, it's not due until tomorrow afternoon," she said, her voice trembling slightly despite her best efforts to keep it steady. "Plans change, lady," Cutter sneered, his lips pulling back from his teeth in a way that was more animalistic than human. "Seems Mr. Finch is mighty eager for you to start your journey a little earlier than scheduled, and in a slightly different direction than you was expecting." He took a menacing step towards her, his shadow falling over her. Abigail instinctively backed away, her hand reaching blindly behind her, closing around the smooth, worn wood of the pitchfork that leaned against the stall. "I'm not going anywhere with you two," she stated, her voice gaining a surprising firmness, fueled by sheer terror. Barlow chuckled, a low, guttural, unpleasant sound that seemed to vibrate in the dusty air. "Oh, I reckon you are, sweetheart. One way or another." He cracked his knuckles with deliberate slowness, the sound echoing ominously in the cavernous, silent barn. Mr. Finch was real clear on that. Fear, sharp and icy, clawed at Abigail's throat. These men were not just reluctantly following orders, they were relishing this, enjoying the power they held over her, anticipating the violence. She was trapped, utterly alone. The town was indifferent. Finch was actively, malevolently cruel, and now his chosen enforcers were here to drag her away into an unknown, undoubtedly perilous fate. She braced herself, raising the pitchfork, its tines glinting faintly, her only flimsy defense against the two leering brutes who were now slowly, deliberately advancing upon her. The little calf, sensing her fear, bleated pitifully at her side, pressing against her legs. Just as Barlow, his face contorted in a savage grin, lunged forward, his meaty, grasping hands outstretched, the great, heavy barn doors at the far end of the structure burst inward with a splintering, resounding crash. A figure on horseback filled the newly created opening, dramatically silhouetted against the last, dying vestiges of daylight. For a heart-stopping, breathless moment, all Abigail could see was the imposing, formidable shape of a warrior, lean and powerful, a long rifle held steady across his thighs. The horse, a magnificent painted stallion with intelligent, fiery eyes, snorted and stamped, its breath pluming in the cool air. It was Koda. He had arrived. Barlow and Cutter froze mid-stride, their aggressive momentum instantly checked, their coarse bravado evaporating like mist in a harsh morning sun. They stared, their mouths agape, their eyes wide with disbelief and a dawning, primal fear, at the sudden, terrifying apparition. This was no drunken cowboy stumbled into the wrong place, no disgruntled farmer come to complain. This was a Navajo warrior, fierce, silent, and utterly formidable, materializing from the deepening twilight like a spirit of vengeance, an ancient guardian of the land. Koda's voice, when he finally spoke, was low and resonant, yet it carried an undeniable, steely authority that sliced through the fear-thickened air of the barn. He spoke in English, his words clear, precise, and devoid of any inflection. "You will not touch her." It was not a request. It was an unequivocal command, backed by an unspoken but palpable threat. Barlow, recovering a fraction of his bluster, though his face remained pale and sweaty beneath the grime, gestured vaguely with a trembling hand. "Now see here, this ain't none of your business, Injun. We're on Mr. Finch's private property, following his direct orders." Koda's eyes, dark and intense as polished obsidian, narrowed almost imperceptibly. He urged his horse a few silent steps further into the barn, the animal's unshod hooves thudding softly, ominously, on the packed earth floor. The dying light from the doorway caught the intricate, colorful beadwork on his buckskin shirt and glinted off the long, blue-black barrel of his rifle. Alistair Finch's orders, he stated flatly, carry no weight beyond the stink of his own pervasive cowardice. He dismounted with a single, fluid, cat-like grace, never taking his piercing gaze off the two suddenly hesitant ranch hands. He was taller than either of them, his lean frame radiating a tightly controlled power, a coiled readiness that was far more intimidating than their brutish, undisciplined bulk. "Finch sent you to abandon this woman in the desert, to leave her to the elements, or worse. Is that the true measure of a man in this town of yours?" Cutter, perhaps emboldened by Barlow's uneasy presence beside him, or simply too stupid to recognize the true extent of his peril, made a sudden, ill-advised move, his hand darting towards the butt of the pistol tucked crudely into his belt. "Now, you just listen here, Redskin." Before Cutter's trembling fingers could close around the grip of his gun, Koda moved with a speed that was startling, almost inhuman. He didn't draw his rifle. He didn't need to. He lunged forward, a blur of controlled, precise motion. One powerful hand shot out, seizing Cutter's descending wrist in an iron, inescapable grip, twisting it sharply, cruelly, upwards. Cutter howled in agony, a high-pitched, animalistic sound, his pistol clattering uselessly to the dirt floor. Simultaneously, Koda's other hand, balled into a tight fist, delivered a hard, decisive, perfectly aimed blow to the side of Barlow's jaw. The big man staggered back, his eyes wide with surprise and acute pain, a grunt escaping his lips, before he collapsed in a boneless, untidy heap near a pile of old harnesses and discarded tack. It was over in mere seconds. Koda stood over the groaning, whimpering Cutter, his expression unreadable, a mask of cold justice. Finch's reign of petty cruelty ends now. He then looked directly at Abigail, and his gaze, though still intense, softened almost imperceptibly. "Are you harmed, woman?" Abigail, still clutching the pitchfork like a lifeline, her knuckles white, could only shake her head, momentarily speechless. The suddenness of the rescue, the warrior's calm, decisive, almost brutal efficiency, had left her breathless, her mind reeling. He had appeared as if from nowhere, an avenging angel from the twilight, just as her last, fragile hope was being extinguished. Who are you?" she finally managed to ask, her voice a hoarse, shaky whisper. "I am Koda," he said simply, as if that explained everything. He then turned his attention back to the whimpering, defeated Cutter, who was cradling his injured wrist. "Go back to your master, Finch. Tell him his cowardly games are over. Tell him that Abigail Henderson is now under my protection. If any further harm comes to her, or if he or his lackeys try to force her from this place again, he will answer directly to me, not in his fancy, protected house, or surrounded by his hired bullies. He will answer to me under the open sky, where man's true heart, or lack thereof, is shown for all to see." Cutter, clutching his throbbing wrist, scrambled unsteadily to his feet. He then helped the dazed and groaning Barlow to his, and they practically fell over each other in their desperate, stumbling haste to escape the confines of the barn and the terrifying, implacable warrior who now commanded it. Their frightened, receding footsteps faded rapidly into the deepening night. As the sounds of their retreat died away, Koda turned back to Abigail. The silence in the barn was now profound, broken only by the soft, occasional nicker of Koda's stallion and the gentle rustle of straw as the little calf nudged against Abigail's leg. Finch is a man who preys on those he perceives as weaker, those without protectors, Koda stated, his gaze steady and unwavering. But his greatest weakness is his own inflated pride, and his abject fear of being seen by others as less than the grand figure he pretends to be. He then revealed something that made Abigail's blood run colder than even Finch's initial disdain. Finch is not just a cruel and arrogant man. He is a deeply dishonest one. He has cheated my people, the Navajo, in trade on more than one occasion, broken sacred promises made over pipe and handshake. He believes his smooth, deceitful words and the white man's settler laws will always protect him from consequence. They will not protect him from true justice. So, Koda's dramatic intervention wasn't just a random act of chivalry from a passing, noble stranger. It was deeply personal. Alistair Finch had made powerful, unforgiving enemies, and his callous, public mistreatment of Abigail was merely the final spark that had ignited a long smoldering powder keg. The warrior wasn't just rescuing her from imminent peril. He was calling Finch to a far greater, more significant accounting, one that went far beyond her rejection. The stakes had just risen dramatically, exponentially, and the dusty, unassuming barn at the edge of Redemption Gulch had become the unlikely, unwilling stage for a confrontation that would shake the fledgling town to its very foundations. The first pale, tentative light of dawn was just beginning to paint the eastern horizon in delicate shades of rose and gray when Alistair Finch, roused from his slumber by his disheveled, bruised, and thoroughly terrified ranch hands, stormed out of his house and towards the barn. His face, normally composed into an expression of smug superiority, was now a mask of apoplectic rage, his expensive silk dressing gown flapping behind him in the cool morning breeze like the agitated wings of an angry, grounded crow. He had expected, indeed demanded, to find the barn empty, Abigail Henderson gone without a trace, his little problem neatly and permanently disposed of. Instead, he found Koda. The Navajo warrior was standing calmly, almost casually, by the main entrance, his long rifle resting lightly in the crook of his arm, his painted stallion tethered nearby, contentedly cropping at a tuft of sparse grass. Abigail stood a little behind him, near the barn wall. Her fear was still evident, but it was now overlaid with a newfound, if hesitant, resolve, a quiet strength drawn from Koda's formidable presence. "What is the meaning of this outrage, you savage?" Finch shrieked, his voice cracking with fury and a tremor of something that looked suspiciously like fear. He pointed a trembling, indignant finger directly at Koda. "You assaulted my man. You are trespassing on my private property. I'll have Sheriff Cobb run you out of this territory on a rail. I'll see you hanged." Koda remained entirely unmoved by the vitriolic outburst, his composure absolute. "Your men, Finch," he replied, his voice dangerously quiet, but carrying with unnerving clarity in the still morning air, were in the process of committing a grievous crime. A crime against a defenseless woman, ordered by a coward. As for trespassing, Koda's lips curved into a faint, mirthless smile. "This land you so boldly claim as yours, it was not always yours to claim. But that, perhaps, is a matter for another day, another reckoning. Today, we speak of Abigail Henderson." A small crowd of townsfolk, drawn by Finch's loud, angry shouting, had begun to gather at a respectful, wary distance. Storekeepers wiping sleep from their eyes, a few early-rising saloon patrons, even some women peering from behind hastily drawn curtains. Their faces were a mixture of apprehension, curiosity, and a certain grim anticipation. This was a drama unfolding in their dusty main street that was far more compelling, far more real, than any drunken saloon brawl or stage traveling show. "She is nothing," Finch spat, his gaze flicking contemptuously towards Abigail, who flinched but held her ground. A misshipment. Damaged goods, returned to sender. She has no place here. She is an embarrassment. She is a human being. Finch, Koda corrected him, his voice dropping to a near whisper, yet each word was like a hammer blow. A concept you seem to have forgotten, if you ever truly understood it. You lured her across a continent with false promises, with lies written on fine paper. Then you callously cast her aside because your pathetic vanity was offended by her very presence. Koda took a single, deliberate step forward, and Finch, despite his bluster and indignation, involuntarily retreated a pace, a flicker of genuine alarm in his eyes. You judged her solely by her appearance. Let us now, before these good people of Redemption Gulch, judge you, Alistair Finch, by your actions, and by your character. Koda then turned and addressed the assembled onlookers, his powerful voice carrying clearly to every listener. This man, Alistair Finch, he began, his arm sweeping to indicate the fuming landowner, speaks often of propriety, of social standing, of bringing civilization to this frontier. Yet, this is a man who would leave a vulnerable woman to die in the wilderness, simply to avoid a minor inconvenience to his pride. He hires bullies and thugs to do his dirty work in the shadows. And this, I tell you, is not the first, nor the most egregious, of his many deceptions. Koda's piercing eyes scanned the crowd, meeting the gaze of several individuals. He has traded falsely with my people, the Navajo, offering shoddy, worthless goods, rusted tools, thin blankets deliberately infected with sickness, in exchange for valuable furs and honestly rendered services. His promises are as empty as his heart, his honor as hollow as a rotted log. He believes himself clever, above the common decencies and unwritten laws that bind honorable men, be they settler or native. A distinct murmur ran through the crowd. Some of Finch's shadier dealings, his notorious arrogance, his sharp, often unethical business practices, were perhaps not entirely unknown to them, whispers that circulated in taverns and around campfires. But to hear it all laid bare, so starkly and fearlessly, by this imposing, stoic warrior, gave these rumors a new, undeniable weight, a sudden, chilling credibility. Lies. All vicious lies. Finch sputtered, his face turning a blotchy, unhealthy shade of mottled red and purple. He's an outlaw, a renegade, a horse thief. Don't listen to a word he says. He's trying to stir up trouble. Abigail, finding a wellspring of courage she hadn't known she possessed, a strength born of desperation and righteous anger, stepped forward to stand beside Koda, facing Finch and the town. Her voice, though not loud, was clear and firm, imbued with the conviction of truth. What Koda says about my treatment is absolutely true. Mr. Finch promised me a home, a partnership, a new life. Instead, he offered me the cold comfort of his barn, and then plotted to have me abandoned to die, simply because my appearance did not please his exacting standards. He judged my worth by my size, not by my spirit, my character, or my ability to contribute to this community. She then looked directly at the townspeople, her gaze sweeping over their faces. Is this the kind of man Redemption Gulch truly wishes to call its own? Is this the standard of honor you uphold here? The town sheriff, a portly, perpetually flustered, and generally indecisive man named Phineas Cobb, finally pushed his way, somewhat reluctantly, to the front of the uneasy crowd, his tin badge glinting dully on his rumpled vest. Now hold on here, folks. Let's all just calm down. Koda, you got no legal right to be making threats or accusations on Mr. Finch's land. And Finch, well, sir, this ain't looking too good for you, not at all. This Injun, has no standing here, Sheriff. Finch insisted, his voice regaining a measure of its former arrogance as he appealed to the symbol of settler law. He's the one breaking the peace. Arrest him. Take him away. Koda met the sheriff's uncertain gaze, his own expression unyielding. I make no threats I do not intend to keep, Sheriff Cobb. I seek only justice, not needless trouble. But Alistair Finch's actions against this woman, and his past transgressions against my people cannot and will not go unanswered. He then did something entirely unexpected. He reached slowly into a beaded pouch at his belt and produced a small, intricately carved wooden bird, its form worn smooth with age and handling. He held it out on his open palm for all to see. This carving, a token of good faith, was given to Alistair Finch by a Navajo elder during a trade negotiation for 10 prime beaver pelts, promised for the coming winter. In return, Finch delivered rusted traps that snapped shut on a man's hand, and blankets so thin they offered no warmth, riddled with a sickness that spread through 2 lodges. An old, grizzled trapper in the crowd, a man known as Mountain Micah, respected for his quiet integrity and his fair dealings with various tribes, stepped forward, his weathered face grim. "I seen them blankets Finch was trading last spring, Sheriff. They weren't fit for a dog, let alone a human soul. Some said they came from an army hospital back east, where the smallpox had been." The tide, which had been slowly turning against Finch, now became a rushing torrent. His carefully constructed facade of respectability and injured innocence was crumbling before his very eyes. His bluster and indignation faded, replaced by a desperate, hunted, cornered look. He looked from Koda's implacable, stony face to the hardening, contemptuous expressions of the townsfolk. He saw Barlow and Cutter, nursing their injuries at the edge of the crowd, offering him no support, their eyes downcast. He was utterly alone, his arrogance stripped bare, his true, petty, cruel nature exposed for all of Redemption Gulch to witness. The raw, physical fear of Koda was palpable, but the dawning scorn and silent judgment of the community, the very people he had sought so desperately to impress and dominate, was perhaps an even more bitter, more devastating pill to swallow. He sagged, the fight visibly draining out of him, like air from a punctured bladder. "All right," he mumbled, his voice barely audible, a hoarse croak of defeat. "All right. Enough." The word was a capitulation, a complete and utter surrender. Justice, in the rugged, unrefined, and often brutal theater of the frontier, had been served, not by a bewigged judge in a formal court of law, but by the unexpected courage of an outcast woman and the unwavering, righteous resolve of a Navajo warrior. The sun, now fully risen above the horizon, seemed to shine a little brighter, a little cleaner, on the dusty main street of Redemption Gulch. In the days and weeks that followed the dramatic dawn confrontation, Alistair Finch became a diminished, almost spectral figure in Redemption Gulch. The profound public humiliation, coupled with Koda's clear, unspoken but ever-present threat, and the thinly veiled disapproval of the townsfolk, stripped him of his arrogant pretensions and his aspirations of local grandeur. Under Koda's watchful eye, and with Sheriff Cobb acting as a reluctant intermediary, he paid Abigail a sum of money that was, by frontier standards, substantial, more than enough for her to make a genuine new start, either by returning east in comfort or by establishing herself in the west, should she choose. He also, grudgingly and with ill-concealed fear, made significant material amends for his deceitful trades with the Navajo, a transaction overseen by Koda with quiet, watchful intensity, ensuring fairness where there had only been fraud. Finch's grand ambitions in Redemption Gulch withered on the vine. His fine house felt less like a mansion and more like a prison of his own making. Within the year, a bitter, resentful, and deeply unpopular man, he sold his property at a considerable loss and drifted further west, seeking some new, unsuspecting place where his tarnished reputation, or lack thereof, was unknown. He was never heard from in those parts again, his name fading into the obscurity he so richly deserved. Abigail Henderson, however, surprised many by choosing not to return to the stifling confines of the East. The ordeal had been harrowing, a trial by fire, but it had also forged something new and unbreakable within her, a steely, quiet resilience and a profound, unshakable confidence in her own worth. With the money from Finch, and with a newfound, if sometimes grudging, respect from many of the townsfolk who had witnessed her quiet dignity and Finch's ultimate downfall, she purchased a small, slightly dilapidated but soundly built abandoned cabin and a promising patch of fertile land on the sunny western edge of town. It had once belonged to a widow who had moved on to Oregon. Finch's grand ambitions in Redemption Gulch withered on the vine. His fine house felt less like a mansion and more like a prison of his own making. Within the year, a bitter, resentful, and deeply unpopular man, he sold his property at a considerable loss and drifted further west, seeking some new, unsuspecting place where his tarnished reputation, or lack thereof, was unknown. He was never heard from in those parts again, his name fading into the obscurity he so richly deserved. Abigail Henderson, however, surprised many by choosing not to return to the stifling confines of the East. The ordeal had been harrowing, a trial by fire, but it had also forged something new and unbreakable within her, a steely, quiet resilience and a profound, unshakable confidence in her own worth. With the money from Finch, and with a newfound, if sometimes grudging, respect from many of the townsfolk who had witnessed her quiet dignity and Finch's ultimate downfall, she purchased a small, slightly dilapidated but soundly built abandoned cabin and a promising patch of fertile land on the sunny western edge of town. It had once belonged to a widow who had moved on to Oregon.